Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak to this motion that would have the Committee on Procedures, Privileges and Legislative Officers, commonly known as PPLOC, undertake a review of initiatives that will encourage more women to offer as candidates to represent New Brunswickers in the New Brunswick Legislative Assembly, report back to the Legislative Assembly within 3 months with specific recommendations. And this is something that is very important to me. I've been passionate about representation in politics of women and of different people, because often when we look at the history of politics and sometimes the present state of politics, there's not enough representation of women, of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, of BIPOC. When we look at people with disabilities, they're often not represented. LGBTQ+ community. Frankly, there's a lot of people who are not represented in this House. And we can change that. These systems were designed by certain people, and when systems are designed by humans, that means humans can change them. That is the hopeful part of all of this. But there were specific types of people that were here initially that put together this system, and it was men, and often white men who were wealthy, and so that was one type of representation that was here. And there's room for more. We need diversity in our legislature, because the role of the legislature is to represent New Brunswickers. And if the population is, about half women, and we don't see that represented here, we know that something's off. And that's the way it is right now. We're talking about, I believe it's 22% right now of the elected members are women, and yet we're closer to 50% of the population. And yet that is a milestone. That's the most ever, and we're still not anywhere near the 30%, which the UN says is a tipping point for having women's voices at the decision-making table actually have more influence. And 30% isn't anywhere near actual representation, but it would be good to at least hit that tipping point. And one of the reasons why it's important to have women in decision-making roles, and let's face it, politics is basically making decisions and prioritizing and making important decisions about our communities. One of the reasons is because the study showed that the decisions made when there's at least that tipping point of 30% women around the table resulted in better policies for not just women, but for children, other groups that have been marginalized by society, and showed better outcomes, basically better policy. So having more diversity, having better representation is good for everyone and is better for governance. There are many things, frankly, that need to be changed in order to, I think, not just attract women into politics, but retain them. There are many issues. And I've referred to, when speaking about gender-inclusive legislatures, I've referred to the Gender-Sensitive Legislatures report that was released by Equal Voice in February 2020 more than once. And it's because they undertook this study to look at the types of recommendations that should be made to legislatures. And they have a variety. And one of the sections is looking at a safe and respectful workplace. And so some of the recommendations include committing to ending gender-based heckling and personal attacks in the chamber, which is looking at legislative decorum. Another is looking at security policies, and one of those includes addressing online threats and social media harassment, which women tend to experience more often. Looking at Pillar 2, family-friendly measures. This is what a lot of the discussion has been about lately, especially I did announce that I'm expecting in June, and there's Thank you. And there's a timeline on some of these parental leave policies. So I am hopeful that we can move forward and implement some of the policies that are needed for not just me. This is about getting it in writing so that any future parent has the necessary accommodations to carry out their work and also be able to have a child, whether they're the one giving birth, whether they have a partner who's doing that, or whether they're adopting. This is one of the things that has kept women out of politics, is the caregiving duties, and there are some adjustments that we can make, and I'm hopeful that this Legislative Assembly is going to make them. And there are different avenues that this is going to go through. I know some things are going to lack, and then looking at attracting more candidates and looking at this specific motion, that this is one of the other avenues to look at what can be done. And so I look forward to seeing what those specific recommendations are. Some of the other things have to do with childcare, and yes, I do think we need to allow for an infant to be on the floor of the House if necessary. We've seen that change made in other legislatures, but also when we are here, it is to work as well, and I want childcare options as well. And so we need to figure out what exactly that looks like, and I know I've been doing research and working to figure out what that could look like here. Another part of this, in terms of family-friendly arrangements, is ensuring that families can travel together as needed. And one thing that comes up in these recommendations is a parliamentary calendar, which we've already debated today, and so I don't need to say as much on it. But we don't have a permanent calendar, and I know some people are, I think, currently tweeting that I seem to have received this document that I actually haven't received before. But we don't have planning very far out all of the time. It often changes, but either way, we don't have a calendar that we can rely on. And that does make it very hard for childcare arrangements, for one thing. The other part, which we've also debated and unfortunately didn't vote on because certain members decided to not let that happen, but is the modernization in terms of looking at remote participation. And so the motion I had made, or the amendment I had made to the motion we debated earlier about hybrid sittings, was to include certain parts of, well, I guess specifically looking at what's in the Legislative Assembly Act. There are reasons for absence that are already laid out in our legislation, such as serious illness, bereavement, serious illness either of the member or of a family member, and then exceptional family circumstances, which includes having a baby, I guess. So those would be reasons to make sure that there is some sort of remote participation policy. The other thing is to look at what proxy voting can look like. And the House of Commons, which, you know, we've talked about tradition being important, but the House of Commons in the UK did a pilot project with proxy voting for people on parental leave, and then have extended it, and they've actually also extended it to include pandemic-related reasons, public health-related reasons. And so there are ways to modernize the legislature that we can undertake. And one final one, which if we'd talked about the salaries, if we'd sat long enough to have enough time to debate all the motions that we were supposed to debate, we would have talked about MLA salaries, and I think we're all in agreement that those should be frozen. But that's an opportunity to talk about how the staff support for MLAs is not always adequate. And this is about supporting MLAs, but ultimately supporting their constituency offices and therefore their constituents. And I would argue that New Brunswick does not do a good enough job of, for one thing, paying the constituency office staff and having enough hours for them. If you look at Nova Scotia, they have full-time staff, plus they have a budget for their office that's big enough that they can hire an additional staff member, and think of the ability to better serve our constituents. And I'm hearing some cheers from the House, because I think we can all relate to, there's a lot coming into an MLA's office, and being able to support everyone in the best way possible and having those resources, that to me is very important, not just as someone who's expecting, but it's a major problem, and it's one of the factors that can be difficult for recruitment into politics, but also for retention. And we talk about recruitment and retention into lots of different fields, and the working conditions can be an issue. I would also argue there's probably some pay equity issues there, because a lot of the constituency coordinators, at least many of the ones that I'm familiar with, are women, but either way, pay equity, looking at the type of work they're doing and the appropriate compensation. So that, I think, is an important thing to examine. There are many other things that I think need to be addressed when we look at these issues. There's some sort of infrastructure type things that I believe are going to be addressed, and so I'm pleased that there will be change tables in the bathrooms, in the legislature. That it seems like a small thing, they're in most restaurants, but we'll have them here in the legislature. And again, when we make changes that are good for women, for example, we can make it more accessible and more inclusive and better for everyone. So sometimes when we make policies, it can improve things for everyone that's been involved. And I appreciated some of the personal stories that were shared earlier, including by the member who moved this motion, and I thought I might just briefly sprinkle some in here too, because it can be challenging. I know I've been told not to run because it would be bad for my family. I've been knocking on doors and been told to go home and stay with my child and to not be in politics. And in, I think, what was well-intentioned advice, I've been told by women in politics, wait till your kids are grown, and there's so much sexism, and I don't know if you want to even get into it. And I haven't listened to this well-intentioned and not so well-intentioned advice, but these are the types of things that are said to people's faces when they do enter politics, unfortunately. Said to my face, and I'm sure I'm not the only woman to have heard this type of thing. But I'm here, there are other women here. I'm hoping that there can be increasingly more diversity in our legislature. This is one step in the right direction. There's a lot more that can be done. And I think it's important to note that this is about, there's a quote, you can't be what you can't see. So we've been talking about setting an example for girls, for younger people. But I also think it's important for little boys and for all children to see women and to see different people, to see diversity in decision-making roles. Because I think it's not just important for girls to see that they can be here. I think it's important for boys to see that women can be in these positions as well. Because we still have issues around power dynamics between the genders, and we still have barriers. Because it was the men that told me to go home, actually, and the woman. So I wanted to make that point, and I will support any move to ensure that we are increasing the diversity of the legislature, that we are making this a more family-friendly, a more gender-inclusive legislature, and I would submit that we have a lot of other work to do on different topics, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is one issue around that diversity, but I'm glad to speak in favor of this motion today, Madam Speaker. So thank you, Madam Speaker.